Part 3. Testing the New Testament. O Allah, the Bible couldn't be right, could it? Chapter 20. Becoming Brothers. There is a simple reason I never listened to street preachers. They didn't seem to care about me. It wasn't that they were annoying. I found their passion admirable, and I appreciated people who stood up for what they believed. Rather, it was that they treated me like an object of their agenda. Did they have any idea how their message would impact my life? Did they even care? Sure, there are street preachers who share their message while still greeting people kindly, getting to know others' troubles, and praying over personal pains, but I never saw them. What I saw were men who would stand on street corners accosting the public with their beliefs. No doubt they reached a few, but they repelled many more. Unfortunately, I have found that many Christians think of evangelism the same way, foisting Christian beliefs on strangers in chance encounters. The problem with this approach is that the gospel requires a radical life change, and not many people are about to listen to strangers telling them to change the way they live. What do they know about others' lives? On the other hand, if a true friend shares the exact same message with heartfelt sincerity, speaking to specific circumstances and struggles, then the message is heard loud and clear. Effective evangelism requires relationships. There are very few exceptions. In my case, I knew of no Christian who truly cared about me, no one who had been a part of my life through thick and thin. I had plenty of Christian acquaintances, and I'm sure they would have been my friends if I had become a Christian, but that kind of friendship is conditional. There were none that I knew who cared about me unconditionally. Since no Christian cared about me, I did not care about their message. But that was about to change. It took a few weeks after 9/11 for life to regain a semblance of normalcy. Baji and I started attending classes again. Abba was back at work, and Ami felt safe enough to run errands. Although Islam was in the hot seat on the news and a general mistrust of Muslims still hung in the air, the wave of emotional attacks was not as bad as we had expected. True, our community mosque was vandalized, and we frequently heard of anti-Muslim sentiments, but we knew of no physical attacks against Muslims. We felt safe to return to our lives, and not a moment too soon. The first forensics tournament of the year was upon us. Like the tournaments in high school, collegiate forensics tournaments were multi-day affairs, often in other states. Our team's first tournament was slated for Westchester, Pennsylvania. On the day of our departure, Ami decided to drive me to ODU so she could see me off. When we arrived at the Batten Arts and Letters building, one of the other students on the forensics team came out to greet us. I had spoken with him a few times at practice, but we were still getting to know each other. He rushed over to us and started helping with my bags while introducing himself to Ami. "Hi, Mrs. Qureshi. I'm David Wood." Ami was glad to meet someone from the team before sending me off to who knows where. "Hello, David. Very nice to meet you. Are you going with Nabeel on this trip?" "Yeah. He told me you might be concerned, but we'll take good care of him. Don't worry." Nothing David could have said would have made Ami happier. "Nabeel, I can tell this is a good boy. Stay close to him." "Acha, Ami, I will." "Keep your phone on you, okay, Nabeel? Call me when you get to the hotel so I know you're safe and so you can give me your hotel room number." "Acha, Ami, I will. I'll be okay. Don't worry." Telling Ami not to worry was like telling her not to breathe, so she just ignored me. "And don't forget to call Abba too, so he knows you're okay." "Acha, Ami." Ami then looked to David. "Remind Nabeel to call us. He's very forgetful." David couldn't hide his smile. "I'll make sure of it." Ami was finally satisfied. "Thank you, David. I'm so glad I got to meet one of Nabeel's friends. After the trip, you should come over to our house for a meal. I'll cook you real Pakistani food." There was no hesitation in David's voice. "You don't have to say that twice. Thanks, Mrs. Qureshi." "Okay, boys, have fun. Be good. Nabeel, call me. And don't forget to pray the Salat." Ami took my face in both her hands and kissed me on the cheek, just as she used to do when I was 4 years old, except now I was the one bending over. David was almost beside himself with repressed glee, expecting me to be embarrassed by Ami's show of affection. But this was normal for our family, and I rather enjoyed receiving this much love from her. As she started to get back in the car, she called out a traditional Pakistani valediction. Khuda Hafiz, beta. May God protect you. Khuda Hafiz, Ami. Love you. As she drove out of the parking lot, David just stared at me, a comical smile painted on his face. What? Oh, nothing, nothing. She does know you'll only be gone for 3 days, right? Yeah, but I don't leave home very often. I picked up some bags and started walking into the building to meet our team. Uh-huh. David picked up the rest of the bags and followed, his silly smile unrelenting. Hey, you know what? It's been a while since you talked to your mother. You really should call her. I stopped and glared at David, then turned around and looked out the main road, and Ami was still there, waiting at a red light to take a left turn. She was watching us walk into the building. Out of playful spite, I turned back to David and said, You know what? I will. Thanks, David, for your heartfelt concern about my relationship with my mother. I pulled out my cell phone and called Ami. David chuckled at himself. And so our friendship was off to a flying start, skipping right past the niceties and straight into brotherly teasing. In the days to come, many would comment that David and I were foils of one another. We were both exactly the same height, 6 feet 3 inches, but I had dark skin and black hair, while David had light skin and blonde hair. I was a slender 175 pounds, while David easily had 40 pounds of muscle over me. I was very meticulous with my appearance and image, while David preferred jeans and t-shirts. I had a pampered childhood, while David came out of the trailer parks and a gritty past. But what I did not know about David was to be the starkest contrast of all. David was a Christian with strong convictions who had spent the previous 5 years of his life studying the Bible and learning to follow Jesus. Even though the gospel was his passion, he did not bombard me with his beliefs straight away. The discussions arose much more naturally after we became friends, and in the context of a life lived together. In fact, I was the one who brought it up. I could not say much more about David's past when this book was first published for 2 reasons. 1. David hadn't yet made his testimony available to the public at the time. And 2. His testimony is so powerful that had I shared the details myself, it would have derailed my story. I am thankful to say, though, that he has since gone public with his testimony, and at this point you're too far into the book to be derailed. So please, buckle up and watch his testimony. It is one of the most powerful stories I know. You will find it here. Chapter 21. Opening My Eyes. The trip up to Westchester was a blast. All the teammates were getting to know one another, practicing their forensics pieces, sharing life stories, and just laughing together. It was a very eye-opening experience for me, since it was my first time becoming intimately acquainted with people who had widely divergent lifestyles and thoughts. One girl on the team advocated legalizing drugs. One of the boys lived with his girlfriend, and another boy lived with his boyfriend. Welcome to college, I thought. We stopped for dinner at an Italian restaurant in Maryland. After the staff arranged a table large enough for all of us, they sat us down next to the kitchen, where we had a clear view of all the cooks. David and I had spent the past few hours getting to know more about each other. We decided to sit together over dinner and split a pizza. David can read people pretty well, and he quickly realized that I do not get offended by playful comments. Far from it, I always appreciate when people let down their guard with me and speak completely unfiltered. Political correctness is for acquaintances, not friends. So as we read through the menu, he turned to me with mock concern and said, Nabeel, since you're probably feeling homesick, I was looking for a pizza that might cheer you up, but they only have a Mediterranean pizza, not Middle Eastern pizza. Unfazed, I replied, But lucky for you, they do have a white pizza. My guess is that it'll be bland and tasteless. You'll love it. David laughed. You're on. I hope this place is authentic. There's a way to test that, you know. Oh, yeah? Yeah, watch this. With that, David turned to the kitchen and yelled, Hey, Tony! Immediately, 3 of the cooks looked over at us, and we started laughing hysterically. David, next time you pull a stunt like that, wait until after they've made our food. So the night continued in light-hearted frivolity. When we finally made it to the hotel, our coach told us there were 2 rooms to be shared among the 4 guys on the trip. It was a no-brainer for us, and before long David and I were getting settled. The rest of the team wanted to go out and celebrate. Most members left to go drinking or dancing at a nearby bar, while some of the others went looking for a suitable place to smoke various things. I had never engaged in any of these activities, and I was not looking to start. David also decided against joining them, which intrigued me. I wondered what made him different from the rest of the team and more like me. I did not have to wait long to find out. While I was unpacking, David sat down in an armchair in the corner of the room and kicked up his feet. He pulled out his Bible and started reading. It's difficult to express just how flabbergasted I was by this. Never in my life had I seen anyone read a Bible in his free time. In fact, I had not even heard of this happening. True, I knew Christians revered the Bible, but I figured they all knew in their hearts that it had been changed over time, and that there was no point in reading it. So in the same moment I found out David was a Christian, I also concluded that he must be especially deluded. Since there were no barriers between us, I just asked him. "So, David," I began, still unpacking my clothes, "are you a hardcore Christian?" David looked amused. "Yeah, I guess I am." "You do realize that the Bible has been corrupted, right?" "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah, it's been changed over time. Everyone knows that." David looked unconvinced, but genuinely interested in what I had to say. "How's that?" "Well, it's obvious. For one, just look at how many Bibles there are. You've got the King James Version, the New International Version, the Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, and who knows how many others. If I want to know exactly what God said, how am I supposed to know which Bible to go to? They're all different." "Okay. Is that the only reason you think the Bible isn't trustworthy?" David's calm and controlled response was surprising. People were usually caught more off guard. "No, there are tons of reasons." "Well, I'm listening." Breaking away from my suitcase, I collected my thoughts. There have been times when Christians take out whole sections of the Bible that they don't want anymore, and they add stuff that they wish were there. Like what? I don't know the exact references, but I know that they added the Trinity into the Bible. Later, when they were called out, they removed it. Oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about 1 John 5. I had no idea what 1 John 5 meant, but I practically jumped him for admitting the flaw. "So you've known all along?" "I know what you're referring to, but I don't think you're seeing it right." "How am I not seeing it right?" "It's not that Christians are just adding and removing things, as if there is some grand conspiracy with people controlling the text of the Bible. I mean, let's just imagine for a second that someone did want to add stuff. Do you think he could just change all the Bibles in the world?" "Well, maybe not all," I admitted, approaching my bed and sitting across from David. "But enough." "Enough to what?" "Enough to effectively change the text." He looked unimpressed. "Nabeel, are you telling me that Christians the world over would just let someone change their holy texts, and that this massive change would not be recorded anywhere in history? Come on." "Not the world over, but I can imagine someone getting away with that in a specific region." "So you agree, then, that if there were an interpolation in a specific region, we would find copies of the Bible without that interpolation elsewhere in the world?" "I guess so." "Well, there you have it," he said with an air of finality. "That explains the multiple versions of the Bible and the issue with the 1 John 5. What? I felt as if I had been playing a game of chess with David, and he had unexpectedly declared checkmate. "The fact that there are manuscripts of the Bible all over the world means we can compare them and see where changes have been introduced. It's a field of biblical study called textual criticism. If anything is changed, like the verse about the Trinity in 1 John 5, then we can easily find the alteration by comparing it to other manuscripts. That explains the major differences between various versions of the Bible. But don't get the wrong idea. There are only a handful of major differences between them." "What about all the minor differences?" Well, those are just stylistic differences in translation for the most part. There are different translations of the Quran, aren't there? Yeah, but they're all using the Arabic text to translate, not foreign language transmissions. Well, it's the same with the Bible. Most of the differences between Bible versions are just matters of translation, not the underlying Hebrew or Greek. I let all this new information sink in, and I looked at David in a new light. Where did he get all this information? Why hadn't I heard it before? I found it all hard to believe. My incredulity won out. David, I don't believe you. I've got to see this for myself. He laughed. Good. You'd be letting me down if you didn't look into this further. But if you're going to do this right, you better bring it. I got up and started walking back toward my suitcase. Oh, don't worry. It's been brought. After I finished unpacking, we focused on final preparations for the tournament. All the while, I kept thinking about our conversation. I was still fully convinced that the Bible was corrupt, but I had to deal with more advanced arguments than I had previously heard. I was excited to return home and dive more deeply into these matters. For much more details on the Muslim view of the Bible, read Part 4 of No God But One, titled The Quran or the Bible, Two Different Scriptures. Chapter 22, Textual Evolution. Before long, we were back at school, catching up on classes. David was a double major in biology and philosophy, and I was pre-med. It turned out we were in a few of the same classes, chemistry and evolutionary biology. Sometimes being in classes together was a good thing. David and I studied chemistry together regularly, with the mutual understanding that it was all-out war. We were trying to outdo one another. After every exam, our professor posted the grades outside the lecture hall, and David and I would clamber over one another to see them. Because of our friendly competition, David and I always had the highest grades in the class. Other times, being in classes together was not a good thing. In evolutionary biology, David and I could hardly pay attention. The teacher made no attempt to hide her atheism, and we were often distracted by her side comments. Being strong theists, we found most atheist arguments petty and unconvincing. Whenever our professor said something with an atheist bent, we would turn to one another and make jokes about it, or about her. We were college kids, after all. One particular day, after a brief pro-atheism tirade, she returned to teaching us about taxonomy, the classification of all living things into kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. I leaned over to David and whispered, "After much observation, I've concluded that her hair has a life of its own. I'm trying to figure out what phylum I'd put it in." David responded with a serious tone. "That's a tough call, Nabeel. It appears to have developed self-defense mechanisms reminiscent to those of scorpions. What do you think?" "Very astute, David. I would have said it looks more like moss or lichen, but now that you mention it, it could very well be a sentient being." The next few moments were spent stifling laughter, and this kind of impertinent banter ultimately led me to drop the evolution course. We just couldn't focus when we were there together. As I went through college, I learned that evolutionary theory had crept into many fields: biology, sociology, anthropology, communications, psychology, and even religious theory. Indeed, there were notes of evolutionary theory in the arguments I used against the Bible. I asserted that the Bible had changed over time, altered in transmission by those in power according to their aims. Later I would come to argue an evolutionary model for the Gospels, that the earliest Gospel, Mark, had a much more human view of Jesus than the later Gospels, and that Jesus' divinity in the Gospels gradually evolved. But for now, David and I were focused on the first point, the textual integrity of the Bible, specifically the New Testament. Like most Muslims, I was not concerned with the Old Testament nearly as much as I was with the New Testament. The way I saw it, the Old Testament mostly agreed with the Quran. It named many of the same prophets, it showed prophets going to war against polytheists, and it did not say anything about the Trinity. The New Testament is what really offends Muslim beliefs, so this is what we discussed. It was after chemistry class one day that David and I continued our discussion about the New Testament. "All right, David, I've been looking into textual criticism some more, and I've found problems." "What do you have?" Looks like I was right about whole sections of the Bible being interpolations. Bible scholars are saying that the end of Mark is not original, and neither is the story in John about the woman caught in adultery. You know, the story where Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone"? Yes, I know that story. You're right, they're not original to the text. What's your point? I was surprised he so readily conceded this point. You don't see this as a problem? I mean, whole portions of the Bible are not actually God's Word. I know what you're getting at, but no, this isn't a problem. Don't you see? The very fact that we can identify these additions means that we can detect alterations. True, but regardless of whether you can detect it, it means the Bible was altered. Later manuscripts, yes, but so what if a later manuscript had alterations? It's not like anyone would consider a later copy more accurate over an earlier copy. The early manuscripts are the ones that matter, and we have many early copies of the New Testament without those interpolations. I considered his suggestion carefully. How many, and how early? Well, we have many manuscripts from the 2nd century in the original Greek, and dozens more in the 3rd century. In our possession today, we still have 2 full New Testaments from the early 4th century. If you want to see how much the Bible has changed from the 4th to the 21st century, all you have to do is pull out manuscripts and compare. This was an interesting proposition. It took all of the conjecture out of the debate. I had to make sure I heard him clearly. So you're telling me that we actually have whole Bibles from the early 300s? Yup. And how different are they from today's Bibles? David looked me square in the eyes. Nabeel, modern translations of the Bible are based on those manuscripts. I considered his words, but the very fact that there were multiple versions continued to bother me. It meant that the words of the Bible were not agreed upon. Aren't the exact words important, David? As a Muslim, I believe that the Quran is exactly the same as it was dictated to Muhammad. Not a single word has ever been changed. From what you are telling me, it seems like you think the exact words of the Bible do not matter. The words do matter, but they matter because they constitute a message. The message is paramount. That's why the Bible can be translated. If the inspiration were tied to words themselves as opposed to their message, then we could never translate the Bible. And if we could never translate it, how could it be a book for all people? I didn't know if David was challenging my view of Quranic inspiration, but what he said made sense. As I silently contemplated his perspective, he continued. Nabeel, I think we should take a step back for a moment and look at this a little more broadly. You are trying to argue that the Bible has been irretrievably changed. But first, you need to be more specific. There are 66 books in the Bible. What part are you talking about? When was it changed, and how? Was it changed in any significant way? I continued to sit in silence. My teachers had never taught me any specifics. They just repeatedly proclaimed that the Bible had been changed. I said nothing. If you think there has been a significant change, you should provide evidence of that. Conjecture is not enough. You need proof. Even though David was making plain sense, I didn't like being in a corner. I already told you, the end of Mark, a story in John, and the interpolation in 1 John 5 about the Trinity are all examples of how the Bible has been changed. And I told you, virtually no scholar considers those segments as parts of the Bible anymore. You need to show me a major change in something we actually consider a part of the Bible. I continued to fight. What if there are other parts like those that we just haven't found yet? That's conjecture again, Nabeel. What if does not constitute much of an argument. What's the claim? Where's the evidence? If there are no specifics, there's no argument. It was clear I was flailing. David leaned back and made his concluding point. When the books of the New Testament were written, they proliferated quickly. They were copied many times, with copies being sent far off to other Christians so they could read them as well. After reading them, those Christians often copied the books before sending them on. How exactly can this kind of proliferation of texts without any central control be uniformly and undetectably altered? How can someone corrupt the words? No one had control over Christendom until hundreds of years after Christ. We have dozens of manuscripts from before that time, and they are the same as today's Bible. There is just no conceivable model for the New Testament to have been changed in any significant sense. No model that's consistent with the facts of history, anyway. I relented for the moment. All right, let me sit on this for a while. David hadn't changed my mind because I knew in my very core that the Bible had been altered. Yet, for some reason, I couldn't figure out how. I began researching the matter in earnest. In the meantime, I decided to try a different approach, denying that the Bible was ever trustworthy in the first place. Chapter 23. Revitalizing Reliability. It wasn't long before David was over at our house, taking Ami up on her offer. When I opened the front door for him, he made a beeline for the refrigerator, which amused Ami tremendously. She found it endearing. But had he used his nose first, he would not have bothered with the fridge. Ami loved cooking for guests, and as was her custom, she had a feast waiting for us on the table. She had prepared lamb korma, goat biryani, chicken makhani, beef nahari, and much more. I'm sure there must have been vegetables on the table, but I always ignored those. When we sat down to eat, David looked happily confused. We were starting with the nihari, a rich beef curry, but there was no silverware on the table. I showed David how to eat with roti, using my fingers to tear the flatbread and scoop up chunks of food. David gingerly followed suit. He made it through the meal without any mishaps, which made me wonder if God was with him after all. Soon we were in the living room, lazing on sofas and basking in the afterglow of our feast. David was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling. Though he had come over to study chemistry, I realized his guard was down, and this was the perfect time to push him on the reliability of the New Testament. For the sake of arguments, I postulated from my chase, let's just say I agree that the New Testament hasn't been changed. Hallelujah, he mumbled, not moving a muscle. Even if it hasn't been changed, that doesn't automatically make it trustworthy. In other words, how do I know that what it says is accurate? David turned to me in mock surprise. But Nabeel, how can you ask such a thing? Doesn't the Quran say the Injil is the word of Allah? It was clear that David had been studying Islam so he could understand me better, and he was right. My position was not common among Muslims, who often believe that the Gospels of the New Testament are the Injil. I'm not convinced the Quran was talking about the Gospels in the New Testament. Maybe it was referring to another book given to Jesus, one that we don't have anymore. I was proposing a view that I had heard espoused by Muslim debaters. David considered this. Well, I'll address your question, but I wonder if you're searching for ways to doubt the New Testament. The only Gospels that even come close to being from Jesus' time are the Gospels of the New Testament. Wait, I interjected. David was making a bold claim, and I wanted to make sure we were clear. Are you saying that the Gospels of the New Testament are earlier than all other accounts of Jesus' life? Yes, all the other accounts of Jesus' life came much later. But I heard that there were many other Gospels, and these were just the ones Christians chose to put in the Bible. There were other Gospels, to be sure, but they all came much later, in the mid-2nd century or afterward. The 4 Gospels in the New Testament are all 1st century, right after Jesus. That's one reason why the early Christians chose them. I tried advancing my case. But what if the Injil was another Gospel, one revealed to Jesus, and it was lost after his death? There are at least 2 critical problems with that, Nabeel. First, it's pure conjecture. What if is not much of an argument if there is no evidence. Second, you know the Quran tells Christians to judge by the Injil. That means they still had it in Muhammad's day. The Injil is not a lost scripture. I tried to respond, but I could not immediately see how to vindicate my position. The more I thought about his argument, the more it left a sour taste in my mouth. Gone was my afterglow. David continued, as objective investigators, if we are going to learn about Jesus' life, we must turn to the Gospels because they are the most likely to be accurate. Where else could we go? I sat up to consider this point. Well, even if they're the best, that doesn't mean they're any good. True, but these books were written shortly after Jesus' crucifixion, in the lifetime of the disciples. That's far better than most other biographies. For example, the main biographies about Alexander the Great were written around 400 years after his death. If we are confident we know anything about Alexander, we should be exponentially more confident in what we know about Jesus. Yeah, but being better than other biographies doesn't mean that the Gospels are trustworthy. You're not getting me. It's not just that the Gospels are temporally closer to Jesus than other biographies are to their subjects, but they are so close that eyewitnesses were still alive at the time. Given that the Gospels were circulating within Christian communities, the eyewitnesses must have heard them and contributed to them. I smiled. That sounds like conjecture to me, David. Where's the evidence? Well, early church fathers record that this is exactly what happened. According to Papias, an author writing around AD 100, the Gospel of Mark is based on Peter's eyewitness testimony. Papias also refers to John and Matthew as disciples. So it's more than conjecture that eyewitnesses contributed to the Gospels. It's recorded history that they actually produced them. What about Luke? Luke was Paul's traveling companion, so he wasn't a disciple. But he says at the beginning of his gospel that he interviewed eyewitnesses, and given that most of what he says agrees with Mark and Matthew, that makes sense. That sounded weak. I don't know, you're admitting Luke wasn't an eyewitness, which is problematic. Plus, I've heard there are many historical inaccuracies in his gospel. David was ready with a response. Luke has given us the most historical data, which means he gives people more opportunities to question him. But the more we find archaeologically, the more he is proven accurate. For example, some scholars used to conclude that Luke chapter 3 verse 1 inaccurately named Lysanias the Tetrarch of Abilene. They argued that Lysanias existed 50 years prior and that Luke mistakenly said he lived during Jesus' time. Christian scholars argued that there very well might have been a second Lysanias, but the skeptical scholars deemed that to be apologetic speculation. It turns out that during an excavation, archaeologists found an inscription dating from the time of Jesus that mentioned a second Lysanias, one who was the Tetrarch of Abila. This proved that skeptics are sometimes too quick to criticize Luke, and that Luke was a reliable source of ancient information. This was all news to me, and it was fascinating, but I did not want to admit, even to myself, that the Gospels were trustworthy. My whole life I had been told I could not trust them, and it would be shameful for me to admit my teachers were wrong. So I continued to push. Can we be sure about all this, David? I mean, I haven't seen these inscriptions, and even if I had, I would not be able to test them for authenticity. Plus, I'm not sure how much I can trust church records. They're biased, after all. There's just too much room for doubt. This seemed to annoy David. Look, Nabeel, you've studied epistemology. You know that, if you wanted to, you could doubt that we're having this conversation, or even that we exist. It's like the Matrix. We could all just be brains in jars being fed stimuli by mad scientists. You can't disprove that. So it all depends on how skeptical you're willing to be. Feel free to be as skeptical as you want, but just don't be inconsistent. If you're going to be this skeptical about the Bible, I want you to be equally skeptical when we take a look at the Quran. Rallied by the mere hint of a challenge to my faith, I perked up. The Quran can take the highest levels of skepticism, David. It's easy to prove that the Quran has never been changed and comes from Allah through Muhammad himself. Insistent, David responded, Nabeel, with the level of skepticism you're proposing today, I'm not sure you could hold to any beliefs. We'll see when we get there, but for now, do you realize we're just working with levels of probability? There's no such thing as absolute certainty, not in the real world. Yeah, that's true. Good. So the best explanation by far is that the Gospels are a reliable source for Jesus' life, unquestionably more reliable than anything else we have. Can you at least agree with that? A rift was beginning to form between my heart and my head. What I wanted to believe was fighting a battle with the evidence for the New Testament. I was torn. Stalling, I glanced over at our chemistry assignment, which was on electronegativity and bond strength. It's too bad religion isn't like science. Then we could just demonstrate which claims are true in a lab. I don't know, Nabeel. Even science is inductive, relying on observations and best explanations, not always deductive conclusions. I don't think what we're discussing is too conceptually different. I stared at him incredulously. Now you're just arguing for the sake of arguing. You just want to disagree with me on everything, don't you?" David laughed. "I hate to say it, but I disagree with that too. Let's just agree to disagree for now." I nodded in affirmation, and with that we turned our attention to chemistry for the rest of the evening. But in the recesses of my mind, I did not disagree with David. Not really. If his facts were accurate, then his arguments made sense. I could not get myself to concede it, though, because there would be a cost to pay. I'd have to admit that my parents and teachers were wrong about the Bible. But they were so adamant, so devoted to God, so genuine. Could they really be wrong? So I did not admit to David that his arguments made sense. In fact, I did not even admit it to myself. To read an expert contribution on the New Testament by Dr. Daniel B. Wallace, a professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary and a senior editor or consultant on 5 Bible translations, see page 304. The New Testament. Daniel B. Wallace. Contributing to Part 3. Testing the New Testament. Dr. Daniel B. Wallace is a professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. He is the senior New Testament editor of the NET Bible and a consultant on 4 other Bible translations. His book on biblical Greek grammar Beyond the Basics, Exegetical Syntax of the New Testament, is the standard textbook in the English-speaking world and has been translated into multiple other languages. In my second year of college, I transferred to Biola University, a small Christian liberal arts school in Southern California. I went there to study the Bible. I had the good fortune of studying Greek from a bona fide textual scholar, Dr. Harry Sturtz. Several weeks into the first semester, on a hot Friday afternoon, Dr. Sturtz briefly informed us that not all the manuscripts of the New Testament said the same thing. In fact, there are hundreds of thousands of textual differences among the manuscripts, Dr. Sturtz calmly stated at the end of the hour. Then, without further explanation, he dismissed the class. I went home that afternoon, bewildered and confused. How can I have any assurance that what we have today is the Word of God? How do I know the Bible hasn't been corrupted beyond all recognition? I had committed my life to Christ a few years earlier. Now I wanted to know if I had given my life to a myth. Thus began my lifelong investigation into the reliability of the text of the New Testament. Dr. Sturtz wanted his students to own their convictions and to study the evidence for themselves. This is why he sometimes threw his charges into existential crises of faith. I've been studying the New Testament for more than 40 years, largely inspired by his model, and I've come to realize that while the great number of variants is only part of that story, it is an important part that attests to the vitality of the gospel. In my spiritual and academic journeys, I have learned that it is imperative for Christians to pursue truth at all costs. And what I have learned about textual variants and their impact on the Christian faith over more than 40 years of examining both published Greek New Testaments and hundreds of individual manuscripts has strengthened my faith in ways I never had thought possible. In this brief essay, I will lay out 3 important facts about textual variants and their impact on the Christian faith. The number of variants. The best estimate today is that among New Testament manuscripts there are about 400,000 textual differences. The reason for this astounding number, however, is the even more astounding number of manuscripts. There is absolutely nothing in the ancient Greco-Roman world that compares to the New Testament in terms of the number of manuscript copies of their dates. The average Greco-Roman author has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence. Usually, there are far fewer. The New Testament boasts more than 5,800 copies in Greek alone, but the New Testament was translated into various languages early on, languages such as Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Georgian, Gothic, Armenian, and Arabic. Altogether, there are more than 20,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. To be sure, some of these are small scraps of papyrus, and most are not complete New Testaments. Nevertheless, the average size manuscript is more than 450 pages long. If all the manuscripts were destroyed in the blink of an eye, we would still not be left without a witness. That's because church fathers from the late 1st century to the 13th century quoted from the New Testament in homilies, commentaries, and theological treatises, and they did not have the gift of brevity. More than 1,000,000 quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers have been collected so far. Virtually the entire New Testament could be reproduced many times over just from the quotations of these fathers. What about the dates of the manuscripts? It is often claimed that there are very few manuscripts of the New Testament written in the first millennium. That is true, relatively speaking. Only 15% of all New Testament manuscripts were produced before the year 1000. But that is still more than 800 manuscripts, more than 40 times the amount of manuscripts from the average classical author in more than 2,000 years of copying. The average classical author has 0 manuscripts extant today produced within half a millennium of the composition of his writings. The New Testament has at least 250 manuscripts, in Greek alone, produced within 500 years after the composition of the New Testament. Within 300 years, the first complete New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus, was produced along with more than 100 other manuscripts that have survived till today. And some of the manuscripts, though fragmentary, were produced within mere decades of the completion of the New Testament. The very fact that Christians were more concerned with getting the message out than with crossing their T's and dotting their I's is testimony to the vibrancy of the Christian faith. How did this passion for the gospel end up changing the message? The nature of variants. More than 70% of all textual variants are mere spelling differences that affect nothing, and several more involve inner Greek syntax that can't even be translated into English or most other languages. Then there are variants that involve synonyms, such as between Jesus and Christ. The meaning is the same, no theological issues are at stake. And there are variants that, though meaningful, are not viable. That is, because of the poor pedigree of the manuscripts they are found in, usually few or very late manuscripts. No plausible case can be given for them reflecting the wording of the original. Remarkably, less than 1% of all textual variants are both meaningful and viable. An example of a meaningful and viable variant is 616 instead of 666 for the number of the beast in Revelation 13 verse 18. But even though meaningful and viable, this variant is not significant enough to affect the essential teachings of the Christian faith. Far and away, the 2 longest passages that are textually doubtful are Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20 and John chapter 7 verses 53 through chapter 8 verse 11. These involve a dozen verses each. The next largest textual variants are only 2 verses long. Only about 24 variants are between 1 and 2 verses long. The consensus of New Testament scholars is that these verses were added to the New Testament later, since they are not found in the earliest and best manuscripts, and they do not fit with the author's known syntax vocabulary or style. No doctrines are impacted by these variants. To be sure, they may involve favorite verses for many people, but they do not in the slightest jeopardize a cardinal tenet of the Christian faith. Christian beliefs affected by textual variants. The fundamental question that these textual variants raise is whether the Christian faith has been fundamentally altered from what the authors of the New Testament originally wrote. Does the resurrection of Jesus depend on textually suspect passages? Is the divinity of Christ found only in verses that are dubious? Such questions obviously should be of profound concern for anyone seeking the truth about Christianity. I wish to conclude this essay by quoting the authority that many Muslims and atheists appeal to regarding textual corruption in the New Testament. In the appendix of Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus, there is a dialogue between the editors of the book and the author. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Ehrman's response is illuminating. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Even the skeptic, a bona fide New Testament scholar, had to concede that no cardinal doctrine of the Christian faith is jeopardized by textual variants. Many atheists and Muslims who have followed in Ehrman's path have exaggerated his claims way out of proportion to what he actually stated. The textual history of the New Testament is robust and fascinating. When the dust has settled, we can be assured that what we have today, in all essentials, and even in the overwhelming majority of particulars, is what they wrote then. My friend Nabeel Qureshi has discovered this same truth for himself. Ever since I met him, shortly after his conversation, I have seen in him an earnestness for truth, an acuteness of intellect, and a heart for God that I have witnessed in only one or two others. I applaud him for his enthusiasm, his zeal to pursue truth at all costs, and to know Christ deeply, and his courage in the face of growing opposition from family and friends. I pray that his book, his spiritual autobiography, will be used by the Spirit of God to reach many people for Christ.